Before dawn on a quiet Saturday morning, the United States Senate pulled off a move that virtually nobody inside the Beltway saw coming. Senators packed their bags, filed out of the Capitol corridors, and vanished from Washington for a month-long recess. What makes this sudden exit so stunning is the timing. They walked away. While the single most critical priority of President Donald Trump's entire 2026 legislative agenda sat completely stalled and unfinished on the negotiating table. We are talking about the Times Save America Act, times the landmark election integrity measure that Trump has repeatedly labeled the master key to his entire platform. And here's the part that is bound to leave you speechless. The legislation was not derailed by some covert Democratic maneuver, nor was it sabotaged by the usual internal party dissenters. In reality, it all came down to a secretive, late-night compromise. Once you discover who actually greenlit that agreement, it is going to completely flip the prevailing narrative on its head. Stay with me through this breakdown, because the events of the past 48 hours have fundamentally rewritten the political battlefield, yet hardly anyone in the mainstream media is reporting what truly transpired behind closed doors. If you believe election integrity matters and want unfiltered coverage of this high-stakes fight right through to the finish line, please take a second to hit that like button and drop a comment below letting me know where you're tuning in from. Every single interaction signals to the algorithm that people want authentic, in-depth analysis on this issue, keeping this channel on the front lines every single day. Let's take it from the top. For those unfamiliar with the specifics of this legislative battle, it is essential to understand what this bill actually mandates and why the White House has wagered an unprecedented amount of political capital on its passage. The Save America Act, formerly titled the Times Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act Times, would mandate that all individuals provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship, such as a valid U.S. passport or a certified birth certificate, when registering to vote in federal elections. Furthermore, the bill would institute a universal photo identification requirement at polling stations before any ballot can be legally cast, a standard already enforced in several states, but one this bill seeks to standardize nationwide. Proof of citizenship to register, government-issued photo ID to vote. That is the fundamental core of the measure. Proponents frame these two requirements as the most basic, common-sense security locks you could install on the front door of American democracy. President Trump has elevated this bill to the very apex of his 2026 legislative priorities, openly declaring that securing its passage is the single best guarantee for protecting the upcoming midterm elections. In the president's eyes, this isn't just standard legislative policy, it is a matter of sheer political survival. Over in the House of Representatives, leadership has pushed the bill across the finish line time and time again. Speaker Mike Johnson laid out their strategic roadmap during a recent appearance on Fox News with Shannon Bream. We passed it 3 times in the House. We're going to try one more time on a budget reconciliation bill, and I think that will be the way to get it through the Senate and finally to the president's desk. Johnson further underscored his alignment with the White House, stating, "The president has that as a top priority, and so do I. 3 separate votes, 3 successful passages in the House, 3 transmissions to the Senate, and every single time, the legislation slammed into an impenetrable brick wall." This naturally raises an obvious question. If Republicans control the White House, hold the House majority, and maintain control of the Senate, how has this bill not already been signed into law? The answer boils down to a single procedural obstacle: the Senate filibuster. Understanding Senate rules, the vast majority of major legislation requires a 60-vote threshold to overcome a filibuster and advance to a final vote. With Republicans holding a modest 3-4-7 majority, they inevitably need at least 7 Democrats to cross the aisle. On this specific measure, bipartisan compromise is non-existent. The bill remains far short of the necessary 60 votes, with 0 Democratic senators willing to lend their support, not a single one. Even moderate or independent-minded Democrats like Pennsylvania's John Fetterman, who has publicly acknowledged that voter ID requirements are not inherently unreasonable, have steadfastly refused to support this legislation, dismissing it as needlessly cumbersome and overly restrictive. The mathematical reality is unforgiving. 53 Republicans facing down a 60-vote barrier. It certainly isn't for a lack of trying. Republican leaders have repeatedly brought the measure to the Senate floor throughout 2026, only to watch it fall short every single time. Senate advocates have continually pressed the issue. Ohio's John Husted framed the party's core philosophy with crisp clarity. We need to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat in America. President Trump even attempted to exert raw executive leverage. When a major bipartisan housing package arrived on his desk for signing, Trump abruptly canceled the formal signing ceremony, explicitly announcing that he would withhold his signature from the housing bill until the Senate passed the voter ID legislation. Consider the magnitude of that maneuver. The president essentially held his own party's major bipartisan housing victory hostage in an effort to force immediate Senate action on election integrity. Meanwhile, tensions inside the House boiled over into an open revolt against leadership. A faction of staunch House conservatives launched a multi-week floor blockade, systematically halting major legislative business until the Senate agreed to act. Representative Anna Paulina Luna publicly threatened to bring the entire legislative apparatus to a standstill unless the election integrity measures were attached to a must-pass vehicle, declaring on X, "I don't care who in this chamber hates me for it." This was not mere political posturing. The House of Representatives was brought to a virtual standstill for weeks over this singular piece of legislation, demonstrating the intense pressure driving this debate. With the legislative front door firmly shut by the filibuster, Speaker Johnson pivoted toward a procedural side door: budget reconciliation. The term should sound familiar, as it represents the same expedited legislative vehicle Republicans previously utilized to advance comprehensive tax and spending packages. A budget reconciliation bill is completely shielded from the 60-vote filibuster threshold and can pass the Senate with a simple 51-vote majority or 50 votes with the vice president casting the decisive tiebreaker. Johnson's strategy was to construct a third reconciliation package and embed the Save America Act directly into its provisions. Johnson was remarkably transparent about the high-level coordination behind the scenes. During a Capitol press conference, he confirmed that he had spoken directly with Trump that very morning, emphasizing that reconciliation offered the only viable path to deliver the bill to the Resolute desk. Emerging from a late-night strategy session with Vice President J.D. Vance and House colleagues, Johnson asserted, "We're going to pass the Save America Act into law, as much of that as possible." However, that strategy immediately ran into a major institutional hurdle: the Senate parliamentarian. Earlier this year, the Senate's nonpartisan rules referee issued a formal determination stating that the Save America Act failed to meet the strict statutory criteria of the Byrd Rule, which dictates what can and cannot be included in a reconciliation bill. In plain English, the parliamentarian ruled that sweeping federal election mandates do not qualify as direct budgetary matters, meaning lawmakers cannot bypass the filibuster simply by packaging broad policy inside a budget bill. Even some of the legislation's most vocal champions acknowledged the legal reality. Representative Luna posted a candid warning to grassroots supporters. The Save America Act cannot be placed in reconciliation, and I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid. Neither should you. Refusing to abandon the effort, Speaker Johnson and his policy team crafted an ingenious financial workaround. Rather than attempting to insert a direct federal mandate into the reconciliation text, the revised proposal established a massive federal grant program that states could voluntarily access to fund the implementation of strict voter ID and citizenship verification systems. Johnson articulated the underlying strategy, explaining that structuring the policy as a grant framework tied to budget reconciliation would allow receptive states and even blue states looking for fiscal incentives to draw down federal funds to modernize and secure their voting infrastructure. We're willing to invest heavily in that, and the number attached to it is real money. The House subsequently passed the reconciliation framework containing $10 billion in dedicated election grants spread over a 10-year horizon by a razor-thin margin of 216 to 214. The margin was exceptionally narrow, just 2 votes, but the House had once again delivered on its commitment. If you are finding value in this comprehensive breakdown, now is the perfect time to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This legislative battle will roar back to life this September, and you won't want to miss the daily play-by-play analysis. The legislative battleground now shifted squarely back to the Senate, the chamber where ambitious House proposals frequently stall. Senate Majority Leader John Thune has been scrutinizing the procedural calculus from day one, and the underlying arithmetic consistently yields the same outcome. The votes are not there. President Trump has persistently lobbied for the procedural nuclear option, demanding that Republican leadership unilaterally eliminate the legislative filibuster to pass the bill with a simple 50-vote majority. Yet Thune has maintained that the votes to dismantle the filibuster do not exist within his own conference. Thune eventually revealed the internal headcounts behind his cautious stance, disclosing that out of a private meeting with 20 key Republican senators, 15 firmly opposed altering the filibuster rules. That represents a 75% rejection rate within his own ranks. Addressing reporters regarding the procedural impasse, Thune stated bluntly, "We are doing everything that we can, but it is a function of math." Despite the mathematical roadblocks, political pressure continued to mount across the country. A significant shift occurred beneath the party's veteran leadership, best exemplified in Texas. Senator John Cornyn, historically one of the staunchest defenders of the Senate filibuster, publicly broke from his decades-long stance. In a dramatic departure from his traditional institutionalist view that the filibuster serves as an indispensable firewall against radical left-wing policies, Cornyn urged his colleagues to execute whatever procedural rule changes were necessary to deliver the bill to President Trump's desk ahead of the November midterms. Why the sudden change of heart? Cornyn found himself locked in a contentious primary runoff against Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. The takeaway is unmistakable. The Republican base is clamoring for this election integrity bill so fiercely that defending procedural traditions has become an acute political liability in primary contests. Louisiana Senator John Kennedy voiced the growing frustration within the rank and file regarding leadership's hesitation, remarking, "I don't think my leadership wants to do it, and I think they're making a huge mistake." As the scheduled August recess drew near, President Trump dialed the political pressure up to maximum intensity, issuing an unequivocal directive online. John Thune should not allow the United States Senate to leave town until it passes the Save America Act, or, far better still, terminates the filibuster. Cancel the vacation, stay in Washington, get it done. If this confrontation feels familiar, it is because it mirrors a nearly identical standoff from the previous summer, when Trump demanded the Senate remain in session through August to clear a backlog of nominees, only for the chamber to adjourn without a resolution. Thune, however, pushed back firmly against calls to keep the Senate trapped in Washington without a viable path forward. "If I thought there was a path to getting a result, I'm all for it. We voted on it 2, 3, 4, 5 times already. Had it up on the floor for an extended period of time. Show me how this ends." What's the picture of victory at the end? He cautioned that trapping lawmakers in Capitol Hill quorum calls served no strategic purpose, particularly when vulnerable incumbents like Susan Collins, John Husted, and Dan Sullivan needed to return to their home states to campaign ahead of the high-stakes midterms. Even Senator Collins, who explicitly supports the policy substance, conceded the mathematical reality, telling the press, "I don't see how you get to 60 votes on it." And I say that as someone who supports the House-passed version of the SAVE Act, which requires proof of citizenship so that only Americans vote in American elections. Senator Shelley Moore Capito captured the prevailing mood among Senate pragmatists. If we had the votes, it would make a lot more sense to cancel the recess. This brings us directly to Friday night, the unexpected turning point that blindsided Washington observers. Despite the public ultimatums, the fiery social media posts, and the demands to keep the chamber in session indefinitely, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, President Donald Trump, and key Senate conservatives hammered out a quiet, late-night agreement. Under the terms of the deal, leadership agreed to set aside the immediate budget resolution vote and postpone further consideration of the Save America Act until the Senate reconvenes after the August recess. Let that sink in. President Trump himself consented to the truce, granting lawmakers the very recess reprieve he had publicly demanded they forfeit. That was the unexpected plot twist nobody foresaw. Before formally adjourning before dawn on Saturday, August 8th, the Senate held one final vote on a targeted voter ID measure sponsored by Senator Husted. The bill failed on a 5-2 to 4-6 vote, marking the 6th unsuccessful attempt to advance the Save America agenda on the Senate floor. Within hours, senators had vacated the Capitol, leaving the president's marquee legislative priority unresolved. In a final detail that speaks volumes about leadership's tactical priorities, Leader Thune filed cloture on an entirely unrelated cryptocurrency, Measure the Times Digital Asset Market Clarity Act, Times guaranteeing that the Senate's opening floor debate in September will center on crypto regulation, rather than election security. What makes this dynamic so compelling is that we have seen this precise political drama play out before, merely with the partisan roles reversed. 4 years ago, Democrats controlled the White House, the House, and the Senate, with their primary legislative goal being a sweeping federal overhaul of voting rights. Their president demanded it, their progressive base insisted upon it, and when the 60-vote filibuster blocked its passage, Democratic leaders attempted to alter the procedural rules. That effort collapsed when two moderate members of their own caucus, Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, refused to weaken the filibuster, causing the signature bill to fail on the Senate floor in full public view. The historical parallel is striking. The Senate filibuster has now successfully blocked the signature voting legislation of back-to-back Democratic and Republican administrations. The 60-vote threshold remains undefeated. The crucial difference this time around is that Republicans still possess an alternative mechanism that Democrats lacked: the $10 billion reconciliation grant framework currently waiting in the wings. Mark your calendar for the September legislative landscape. The Senate reconvenes on September 14th, facing an immediate, high-stakes government funding deadline at the end of the fiscal year, followed by another scheduled recess in October for final midterm campaigning ahead of the November 3rd elections. Lawmakers will have only a compressed window of active legislative days when a potential government shutdown battle, the budget reconciliation package, and the Save America Act will all collide simultaneously, just weeks before voters decide control of Congress. Speaker Johnson has already signaled his next play, promising conservative members that he will attach voter eligibility provisions to upcoming must-pass appropriations bills alongside the reconciliation vehicle. This means the fight over election integrity will be directly tethered to the emergency measures required to keep the federal government open. To present the complete, objective picture, both sides maintain deeply entrenched policy arguments in this debate. Opponents and voting rights advocates argue that strict citizenship documentation mandates could disenfranchise an estimated 20 million eligible American citizens who may lack immediate access to certified birth certificates or passports. They further emphasize that non-citizen voting is already strictly prohibited under federal law, citing empirical studies showing documented instances are exceedingly rare. Conversely, proponents counter that national polling consistently reflects overwhelming, bipartisan public support for mandatory voter ID and citizenship verification. They point out that numerous established democracies around the world require formal identification to vote, arguing that strengthening public trust and confidence in election outcomes far outweighs any administrative burdens. So, where does this unprecedented legislative battle stand today? It stands at 6 failed Senate floor votes, a dramatic 2-vote victory in the House, a $10 billion grant workaround waiting in reserve, a Senate majority leader demanding a realistic path to 60 votes, and a president demanding the procedural rules be dismantled, all paused under a fragile truce that expires the moment senators return to the Capitol on September 14th. The next 5 weeks will be defined by relentless grassroots pressure, intense primary dynamics, and one central question: will the reconciliation workaround survive the Senate parliamentarian scrutiny, or will President Trump ultimately muster the 50 votes needed to alter the Senate rules once and for all? I will be tracking every development around the clock, bringing you updates the moment news breaks. Now, I want to hear from you. Should Senate Republicans eliminate the filibuster to pass the Save America Act? Let me know your thoughts and where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Then click the next video on your screen to explore our in-depth preview of the high-stakes September showdown that could define the midterm elections.